Hey, what's up, photographers? I had a question about how in the videos I was changing my exposure settings so quickly when the action was a little bit more intense. So the birds are moving quickly and that sort of thing. And it's a great question. And it's one of the methods that I love shooting aperture priority with auto ISO. I'm going to do another separate video all on manual ISO versus auto ISO, but real quick, I just wanted to answer this one question because I think it's something that many people certainly struggle with, and it kind of takes away from creativity if you're so focused on getting a proper exposure and keeping your subject in focus that you don't really have the ability to have your mind free to think about different, more creative compositions and perspectives and foreground, background, all that sort of stuff. So here's what I do. I have my camera set with aperture priority with auto ISO. And the reason I choose aperture priority is because I get to pick the aperture. So I pick the lowest aperture my lens will shoot. In this case, on the 100 to 400, it's f/5.6 on the long end. So I'm gonna set the aperture at 5.6, and then I get to play with the exposure compensation on my thumb while I'm focusing with my shutter button. So I do not use back button autofocus. That's another key important setup of being able to do this, to being able to change my settings so quickly. If I'm using back button autofocus, check my back button autofocus video, which should already be out. I have to use my thumb on the AF on button, and I don't have a finger free to change settings for either my back wheel or my front wheel because I'm using my thumb to focus and my pointer finger to actually take the photo. Because I don't use back button autofocus, I'm focusing and shooting with just my finger, which leaves my thumb free to change this back wheel. If I'm in a manual exposure, I can change my shutter speed with it. Or in this case, when I'm in aperture priority with auto ISO, I get to change exposure compensation. So let's dive into the menu. This is Nikon specific right now. I'm not sure if Sony or Canon or any other brand allows this one particular setting, but the auto ISO settings do apply to all. So let's take a look at the auto ISO settings first. So we'll go into the menu and we go to our ISO sensitivity settings. On the Nikon, you basically set your base ISO. I usually go with like 400, 200, something like that. There's a reason I don't go with 100 or 64. It's a long explanation I'm not going to get into on this video. There are certain circumstances that come up where it's nice to have that minimum ISO a little bit higher. So then the next important thing is to set the maximum ISO sensitivity, so as high as you want that ISO range to go. In my case, I let it go up to 16,000 ISO. I'm okay with getting a shot at that. I don't like to get a shot that high, but I'm okay getting it that high if it needs to because it's that dark. And then this is the important part of using aperture priority with auto ISO, and that is setting the minimum shutter speed right there, okay? So for me, my go-to walk around minimum shutter speed is 5/100 of a second. If I hop into that setting, you can see I get to pick the minimum shutter speed that the camera is going to give me. Like I said, mine is 5/100 of a second for just standard, mostly static subjects. If I was going to be shooting action, I would certainly go up to something like 1,000th of a second or 1,600, 2,000th of a second, something like that. But in this case, we'll just stay with 5/100 of a second. So once I have that set, you can see as I point around here, let's look through the viewfinder now. So as I pan around and focus on my subject, you can see the camera is keeping me at 5/100 of a second, and it's changing the ISO for me. Right now I have no exposure compensation set, it's set at 0. And so it's a little bit light in this circumstance. But watch, if I swing over here, I got another bird over here, which has a little bit of a brighter background. Once I focus on him, he's actually, I would say, a little bit dark because of the bright background. And you can see in this case, the ISO went down to that 400 and the shutter speed went up for me. So no matter where I'm pointing, I'm not going below 5/100 of a second, and the ISO is changing for me. Now here's the key. I'm going to go into the menu one more time on Nikon, and this is the setting that I'm not sure other camera companies have. And I'm going to go into my metering and exposure settings, and I'm going to turn on a thing called easy exposure compensation. I leave that on auto reset, and the reason is because when I change the exposure compensation, every time the meter resets itself, so basically once the camera, the numbers time out and they disappear off the top of your screen, you know how the camera kind of goes into like a sleep mode. Once that happens, it's going to reset my exposure compensation back to neutral, so I don't have it set from one scene and then go and shoot another scene and have a completely different wrong exposure compensation. I like it to be reset every time. If you didn't want that, you'd go into that same setting and just turn on easy exposure compensation and leave it on, okay? So I'm going to leave it on auto reset, and let's watch what happens. because I've done that, I no longer have to press my exposure compensation button up here. I get to just roll my back wheel. And let's see what happens. So I'm gonna look at this bird here, focus on him, and I'm gonna darken it. There's that shot. Then real quick, I'll switch over here to this bird and take that shot, and look, just like that, I'll lighten it, okay? And get that shot. So now I'm plus a stop, and then I come back over here, this bird, oh, he's way light, darken him, take that shot. Look how fast and easy that was for me to change that exposure. Watch, I'm gonna show you guys again right now. Just watch my hand, right? So lighter, darker. The whole time I am actually using my finger up here to half press and focus on the subject. So I can actually, if I want, let me just flip this up here so I can take a look. I can actually freely compose the subject any different way I want, right? So I can keep doing that. I can even change my zoom if I wanted here. I can zoom out and change them because that's going to change what my camera sees, so I can go a little bit darker there. But look at this. As I'm doing this, I'm changing the exposure the entire time because my thumb is free to do that. And then I can take the photos as I go. So that is the answer. It is a combination of aperture priority with auto ISO and having easy exposure compensation turned on, so I don't have to press the exposure compensation button to change my exposure. And basically what this allows me to do is not think about my camera settings at all. And guys, that's how I shoot a lot of various conditions or changing lighting conditions, right? If I'm out in the open and the lighting is going to be really consistent and not changing at all, I'm just going to dial in a manual exposure and leave it at that. I don't need to worry about changing the exposure all over the place. But for all the other circumstances, like this is a perfect example. It's a little bit darker background over here. It's more shaded over here. It's sun, it's clouds, it's coming in and out. I don't know where the bird's gonna be. I don't wanna be fumbling around with changing settings, fumbling around, changing my ISO up and down. I don't even wanna have to think about that. I wanna think about getting focus, which is much easier with these cameras now, but mainly I wanna think about what's in my background, my foreground, perspective, composition, those sort of things. And with this setting setup, that's a fun word, I don't have to think about my settings at all, and I really don't. I basically just look through the viewfinder, dial in a good exposure, and I take the shot. That's all I really think about. I don't pay attention to my shutter speed, I don't pay attention to my ISO. The camera does all that work for me, but I know it's gonna stay within range. Of course, I don't ignore those settings at all, right? If all of a sudden I'm shooting action, I know I need to get my shutter speed up, so I either have to change into manual, or I have to change that minimum shutter speed to something a little bit higher. Also, if I notice it's getting really dark and my ISO is starting to really skyrocket and it's getting a little bit higher, I know I need to lower that shutter speed or do something else to change how high that ISO is going. So I don't ignore them altogether, but for many conditions where there's enough light and it's within the range of these parameters I've set, I absolutely love this and it works really, really good for me. So give it a shot. It may work for you. For some people, it just doesn't work, but that is how I'm able to change my settings so quickly and get the exposure I want without having to fumble around and mess around with things too much.